The waiting room at the VA hospital was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that felt heavy. The walls, painted in muted colors, carried the faint smell of antiseptic, and the buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights hummed softly. Veterans sat scattered across the room, some flipping through outdated magazines, others lost in thought. A sense of patience, of quiet respect, filled the air. That is, until the doors swung open. In walked a group of bikers, their presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. Leather jackets adorned with bold patches, chains clinking with every step, and an air of defiance surrounded them. They weren't your typical veterans or visitors. Their loud conversations and boisterous laughter clashed with the solemn vibe of the space. People glanced up, some with curiosity, others with visible irritation. The bikers didn't seem to care. They sprawled across chairs, a couple of them leaning against the walls, as if the waiting room was their personal hangout spot. One of them, a tall guy with a scruffy beard and mirrored sunglasses, started tossing an empty soda can in the air, letting it drop loudly to the floor over and over. Another flicked through his phone, blasting music at a volume no one could ignore. An older man in the corner shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand gripping the cane resting beside him. A younger veteran in a wheelchair muttered something under his breath, but stayed silent. Nobody wanted to engage with the group. They seemed like the type who thrived on confrontation. But one man in the room didn't react at all. Sitting in the farthest corner, his posture calm and unreadable, he looked like any other patient. Dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans, his face was partially hidden under a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't seem to mind the biker's antics, his focus entirely on the clipboard in his hands as he filled out some forms. What nobody knew, what the bikers were about to learn the hard way, was that this seemingly ordinary man wasn't here for a routine checkup. He wasn't here by chance. And he definitely wasn't someone to be underestimated. The guy with the soda can aimed it toward a trash bin across the room, but instead of landing there, the can hit the edge and bounced off, rolling loudly across the floor. It stopped near the quiet man's feet. He paused, his pen stilling mid-word, then slowly looked up. "Hey, buddy," the biker called out, a smirk on his face. "Mind tossing that back over here?" The man didn't respond right away. He set his clipboard down neatly on the chair beside him, picked up the can, and stood up. He was taller than he'd seemed sitting down, his build more solid than any of them had realized. His movements were deliberate, almost too calm. He walked toward the group with a can in his hand, each step steady and measured. The smirk on the biker's face faltered for just a second, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "Thanks, man," he said, holding out his hand. But the man didn't hand it to him. Instead, he stopped just short of the group, his gaze sweeping over them. Steady, cool, unflinching. The waiting room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes now locked on this quiet stranger. "You drop this," he said finally, his voice low but firm. He set the can down on the floor in front of the biker instead of placing it in his hand. The gesture wasn't loud or aggressive, but there was something about it that made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. The biker blinked, his smirk gone now. "What's your deal, man?" he said, his tone shifting from playful to defensive. The quiet man didn't answer. He simply stepped back and returned to his seat, picking up his clipboard as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. The bikers exchanged glances, their earlier bravado dimmed by a sudden unease. They didn't know it yet, but they had just made their first mistake. And it wouldn't be their last. The silence that followed was more telling than any words. The bikers exchanged uneasy looks, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to confusion. The quiet man had returned to his seat, his expression as unreadable as ever. He resumed filling out his paperwork as if the encounter hadn't happened, but the tension lingered in the air. The biker who had tossed the can, let's call him Rick, leaned back against his chair, drumming his fingers on the armrest. "What's his problem?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. One of his buddies, a stocky guy with a shaved head and a tattoo peeking out from his collar, chuckled. "Probably thinks he's some kind of tough guy," he said, his voice low but still loud enough for others to hear. The older man with the cane in the corner shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes flicked toward the quiet man for a moment before he looked down, choosing not to get involved. The room felt like it was holding its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Rick wasn't the type to let things go. He hated being shown up, especially in front of his friends. "Hey," he called out, his voice louder now. "I'm talking to you." The man didn't look up. He continued writing, his pen moving steadily across the page. Rick stood up, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You deaf or something?" he said, taking a step closer. The sound of his boots echoed in the quiet room. Finally, the man set his pen down and looked up. His eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his cap, were calm but piercing. He didn't say anything, just stared at Rick with a quiet intensity that seemed to unsettle him. "You got something to say, old man?" Rick asked, trying to sound tough, but there was a slight edge to his voice now. The man leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. "Not really," he said, his tone even. Rick took another step closer, clearly looking for a reaction. "You think you're better than me, sitting there all quiet like that." "Huh?" The man didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying Rick. "You done?" he asked, his voice still calm. Rick froze for a moment, caught off guard by the question. Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Oh, I'm just getting started," he said. Before he could say anything else, one of the nurses appeared in the doorway. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a kind face and a clipboard in her hands. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. The quiet man stood up, picking up his clipboard. Without a word, he walked past Rick and toward the nurse, his movements smooth and unhurried. The nurse gave Rick a quick glance, her expression wary, before leading the man through the door and down the hall. As soon as they were out of sight, Rick turned back to his friends. "Can you believe that guy?" he said, his voice rising. "Thinks he's some kind of big shot." The others muttered in agreement, but there was an undercurrent of unease in their tone. They weren't used to people standing up to Rick, and they certainly weren't used to someone doing it so calmly. Meanwhile, down the hall, the nurse led the quiet man to a small office. She gestured for him to take a seat. "Sorry about the wait," she said, her voice warm and professional. "Dr. Carter will be with you in a few minutes." "Thanks," he said, sitting down. As the nurse closed the door behind her, the man allowed himself a small sigh. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes scanning the room. The walls were lined with certificates and photos of the doctor with various patients and colleagues. A small clock ticked softly on the desk. He wasn't here for a routine checkup. He wasn't here for any medical reason at all. His presence at the hospital was part of something much bigger, something he couldn't discuss with anyone in that waiting room. The bikers, for instance, had no idea who they were messing with. Back in the waiting room, Rick was still fuming. What kind of guy acts like that? Doesn't even have the guts to say something to my face, he said, pacing the room. One of his friends shrugged. Maybe he's just some weirdo. Who cares? Rick stopped pacing and turned to him. "I care," he said, his voice sharp. "You don't just walk away from me like that." The stocky guy with the tattoo leaned forward in his chair. Look, man, maybe let it go. This place isn't exactly the spot for. But Rick wasn't listening. He wasn't the type to let things go, especially when his pride was on the line. He made up his mind then and there that he wasn't done with the quiet man. The older man with the cane cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "You boys might want to think about showing some respect," he said, his voice steady but firm. Rick turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you, old-timer?" The older man met his gaze without flinching. "Someone who's seen more than you'll ever know," he said. "And I'm telling you, you're picking a fight you don't want." Rick scoffed. "Yeah. And what makes you so sure about that?" The older man didn't answer. He just shook his head and looked away, as if he already knew how this was going to end. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. The tension in the room was thick, but no one said anything more. Rick sat back down, but his mind was racing. He didn't like being told what to do, and he definitely didn't like being made to feel small. He decided he'd wait for the quiet man to come back. He wanted answers. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted a little payback too. Rick leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the hallway door where the quiet man had disappeared. He didn't like being brushed off. To him, it wasn't just disrespect, it was a challenge. Challenges like that didn't sit well with him, not when he had an audience. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy named Dale, leaned forward and whispered, "You really gonna wait for him to come back?" Rick shot him a look. "Damn right I am. You think I'm gonna let some nobody walk in here and act like he owns the place?" The rest of the group shifted uncomfortably. They weren't exactly saints, but something about this situation didn't feel right. There was an energy in the room that none of them could shake, like they were in over their heads, but didn't know why. Meanwhile, the quiet man sat in the small office, his mind somewhere else entirely. He wasn't thinking about Rick or the commotion in the waiting room. His thoughts were focused on the reason he was there. A confidential operation that had brought him to the VA hospital under the guise of a routine check-in. The door opened, and Dr. Carter stepped in. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor. She glanced at the clipboard in her hands, then at the man sitting across from her. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, closing the door behind her. "Thank you for waiting." He gave her a small nod. "Not a problem." She set the clipboard on the desk and leaned forward slightly. "I've reviewed the file you sent over. Everything seems in order, but I have to ask, are you sure about this?" His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's proceed." Back in the waiting room, Rick's impatience was boiling over. He stood up and started pacing again, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. "How long does it take to fill out some paperwork?" He muttered. "Maybe he's actually here for something serious," Dale offered. Rick scoffed. "Yeah, right. Guy like that, probably just trying to look important." The older man with the cane spoke up again, his tone calm but firm. "You boys really don't know when to leave well enough alone, do you?" Rick turned on him, his irritation flaring. "What's your deal, huh? You keep sticking your nose in where it doesn't belong." The older man met Rick's glare without blinking. "I'm just saying you should think twice before you start something you can't finish." Rick laughed, but it was a forced, hollow sound. "You don't know me, old man. I finish everything I start." The older man shook his head, his expression almost pitying. "You'll learn," he said quietly. In the hallway, the quiet man, Mr. Reynolds, emerged from the office. His movements were as calm and deliberate as before, his expression unreadable. He walked past the reception desk and headed toward the waiting room, his eyes scanning the space as he entered. Rick spotted him immediately and straightened up. "There he is," he said, his voice loud and challenging. The quiet man paused, his gaze locking onto Rick's. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Rick took a step forward, his chest puffed out. "You think you can just walk away from me like that? Not how it works, buddy." The quiet man didn't respond right away. He stood there, perfectly still, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Rick's aggression. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and measured. "What do you want?" Rick smirked, emboldened by the question. "Oh, now you're ready to talk. That's more like it." The quiet man didn't react, his expression remaining neutral. "If you've got something to say, say it." Rick hesitated, thrown off by the man's composure. He had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even fear. But this was something else entirely. One of the bikers, the stocky guy with the tattoo, stood up and placed a hand on Rick's shoulder. "Hey man, maybe we should just let it go. This isn't worth it." Rick shrugged him off. "Stay out of it," he snapped. The older man with the cane cleared his throat again, drawing everyone's attention. "I warned you," he said simply. Rick turned toward him, his frustration boiling over. "What is it with you, huh? You some kind of prophet or something?" The older man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but watchful. Rick turned back to the quiet man, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're lucky we're in a hospital," he said, his voice low and threatening. The quiet man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Is that so?" Before Rick could respond, the door to the hallway opened again, and two men in suits walked in. They scanned the room quickly, their eyes landing on the quiet man. One of them nodded slightly, a silent signal that passed between them. The quiet man straightened up, his posture shifting subtly. Without a word, he walked past Rick and toward the two men. They exchanged a few quiet words, then turned and headed back down the hallway together, leaving the waiting room in stunned silence. Rick stared after them, his jaw clenched. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. The older man with the cane spoke up one last time. That, he said, was someone you should have left alone. Rick didn't know it yet, but he had just gotten a glimpse of a world far bigger and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. And the consequences of his actions were only just beginning to unfold. Rick's frustration simmered as the quiet man disappeared down the hallway with the two men in suits. The tension in the waiting room was palpable now, everyone sensing that something was unfolding beyond their understanding. Rick, however, wasn't one to back down, even when he didn't have the full picture. "What's his deal?" Rick muttered, pacing again. "Who are those guys?" The older man with the cane didn't respond this time. He simply watched Rick, his eyes steady and knowing, like he'd seen this kind of thing play out before. Rick's buddy Dale leaned in, lowering his voice. "Maybe we should just leave, man. Something about this feels off." But Rick wasn't having it. No way. He thinks he can just walk in here, act like that, and then stroll off like he's untouchable. Not a chance. The receptionist at the front desk gave them a wary glance, her fingers hovering over her keyboard, as if considering whether to call security. She didn't, but her unease was clear. Meanwhile, down the hallway, the quiet man, now flanked by the two men in suits, walked with purpose. They spoke in low tones, their conversation inaudible to anyone nearby. Whatever was happening, it was serious. The hallway led to a restricted area of the hospital, one reserved for staff and authorized personnel only. One of the men swiped a badge to open a heavy door, and the three of them disappeared inside. Back in the waiting room, Rick was losing patience. I'm not sitting here all day, he said, grabbing his leather jacket off the back of his chair. Let's see where he went. Dale hesitated, glancing at the others. You sure about this? What if we get kicked out or something? Rick shot him a glare. You scared now? You're the one who said this guy was acting weird. Don't you want to know why? Reluctantly, the others followed Rick as he stormed out of the waiting room and into the hallway. The older man with the cane watched them go, his expression unreadable. Rick led the group down the hall, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. When he reached the door to the restricted area, he tried the handle, but it was locked. He rattled it in frustration, glancing around for another way in. What now? Dale asked, his voice uneasy. Rick spotted a small window in the door, just large enough to peer through. He leaned in, cupping his hands around his face to block out the light. Can't see much, he muttered. Just a bunch of hallways. Behind him, the others shifted nervously. Maybe we should just go back, one of them suggested. But Rick ignored him, his mind set on finding out what was going on. He glanced at a security camera mounted in the corner and smirked. Let them come. I'm not afraid of a little trouble. Inside the restricted area, the quiet man was standing in a small, sterile-looking room. One of the men in suits was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, while the other opened a metal case on the table. The quiet man remained calm, his eyes scanning the contents of the case. Everything's in place, one of the suited men said, ending the call. We're moving forward as planned. The quiet man nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. Let's get this done. Outside the door, Rick was growing more impatient by the second. He pounded on the metal surface with his fist. Hey, open up. The noise echoed down the hallway, drawing the attention of a passing nurse. She stopped and stared at the group, her eyes widening. What are you doing back here? She asked, her tone sharp. Rick turned to her, his frustration spilling over. We're just trying to find someone. That guy who came in with the suits, what's his deal? The nurse frowned, her posture stiffening. You're not supposed to be here. This area is for authorized personnel only. Rick took a step toward her, his voice lowering. Yeah? Well, maybe you can authorize us, huh? The nurse's expression hardened, and she reached for the phone clipped to her scrubs. I'm calling security. But before she could dial, the door to the restricted area opened. The quiet man stepped out, his face calm, but his presence commanding. The two suited men stood behind him, their expressions unreadable. Rick froze for a moment, caught off guard. But his bravado returned quickly. There you are, he said, taking a step forward. Mind explaining what's going on here? The quiet man didn't answer right away. He looked at Rick, then at the group behind him, and finally at the nurse. It's fine, he said to her, his voice steady. I'll handle this. The nurse hesitated, but eventually nodded, stepping back. She glanced at the suited man, who gave her a small nod before walking away. The quiet man turned his attention back to Rick, his eyes calm but piercing. You're looking for answers, he said, his tone measured. But you're not going to like what you find. Rick smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Try me. The quiet man stepped closer, his movements deliberate. You think this is about you, about some grudge or slight. But it's not. There's a lot you don't know, and if you're smart, you'll leave it that way. Rick's smirk faltered. What's that supposed to mean? It means, the quiet man said, his voice dropping lower, you've already stepped into something far bigger than you realize. And if you keep pushing, you're going to regret it. The group behind Rick shifted nervously, sensing the weight of the quiet man's words. But Rick, stubborn as ever, wasn't ready to back down. Is that a threat? The quiet man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back through the door, the suited men following him. The door closed with a heavy click, leaving Rick and his group standing in the hallway, the tension thick enough to choke on. For the first time, Rick wasn't sure what to do. And for the first time, he felt the faintest hint of fear. Rick stood frozen in the hallway, his hand still hovering near the door handle, as if he might follow. But for once he hesitated. The quiet man's words played over in his mind. Asterisk, you've already stepped into something far bigger than you realize, asterisk, it didn't sit right with him. Rick wasn't used to being the one left in the dark, and he hated the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind, telling him he might have underestimated this situation. Dale broke the silence, his voice low and cautious. Maybe we should just go, man. This is getting weird. Rick turned to him, his frustration flashing again. You can leave if you want, but I'm not done. He glanced back at the door, his jaw tightening. He knows something. He's hiding something. What if it's, like, government stuff? Another one of the bikers piped up. I mean, those guys in suits didn't exactly look like hospital staff. Rick ignored him, his attention snapping to the security camera in the corner. He suddenly had an idea. Fine, he said, stepping back. If they won't tell me what's going on, I'll find out myself. He stormed back down the hall toward the receptionist's desk, his group trailing behind him reluctantly. The receptionist looked up, her expression immediately wary. Sir, I've already called security. You need tow. Rick cut her off, leaning on the counter. I don't care who you called. I need to know who that guy is. The one who just went into the back with the suits. The receptionist blinked, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. That information is confidential, she said firmly. You need to leave now. Rick leaned closer, his voice lowering. Look, lady, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just need to know if he's supposed to be here. She hesitated, glancing at the screen in front of her. All patients and visitors are authorized to be in the areas they're assigned to, she said carefully. That's all I can tell you. Rick narrowed his eyes, about to press further when a sharp voice interrupted them. That's enough. The group turned to see a hospital security guard approaching, his expression serious. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a badge clipped to his chest and a no-nonsense demeanor. You're disrupting the hospital, the guard said, stopping a few feet away. I need you to leave the premises now. Rick straightened, his frustration boiling over. Or what? The guard didn't flinch. Or will have you removed. Dale tugged on Rick's arm. Come on, man. Let's just go. But before Rick could respond, the door to the restricted area opened again. This time, only one of the suited men stepped out. He scanned the hallway quickly, his eyes landing on Rick. For a moment, they locked eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, something cold and calculated. The suited man approached the receptionist's desk, ignoring Rick completely. Everything is secure, he said to her in a low voice. If anyone asks, we've moved to Phase 2. Rick frowned, his frustration giving way to confusion. Phase 2? What's that supposed to mean? The suited man turned to him slowly, his expression blank, but his eyes sharp. It means you're out of your depth, he said evenly. Rick bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. Why don't you try explaining it to me? The suited man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You've been poking around where you don't belong. That's your first mistake. Don't make another one. The tension in the hallway was electric. Rick stared at the suited man, his bravado faltering for the first time. He didn't know what he'd expected, but it wasn't this. The suited man turned back to the receptionist. Make sure the cameras from this wing are wiped. We can't leave any loose ends. Rick's breath caught at those words. Asterisk wiped cameras? Loose ends asterisk, it sounded like something out of a movie, but the cold precision in the man's tone left no room for doubt. The older man with the cane suddenly appeared at the edge of the hallway, leaning against the wall and watching silently. Rick spotted him and felt a surge of frustration. "You again," he muttered. The older man didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the suited man. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "It's not too late for you to walk away, kid." Rick shook his head, the uncertainty and tension finally reaching a breaking point. "No, I'm not walking away from this. Not now." The suited man turned, his expression hardening. "Then you'd better be ready for what's coming." And with that, he disappeared back through the door, leaving Rick and his group standing in the hallway, the weight of his words pressing down on them like a storm about to break. Rick stood in the hallway, his mind racing. The tension was unbearable now, every word, every glance feeding into the growing sense of dread. He glanced at Dale and the others, their nervous faces reflecting his own uncertainty. They had come here on a whim, a typical day for their rowdy crew, but now it felt like they had wandered into something far more dangerous than any bar brawl or backroad chase. The older man with the cane approached, his movements deliberate, his eyes steady on Rick. He stopped just short of the group, leaning heavily on his cane. "I told you," he said quietly, "this isn't your fight. But it's not too late to back out." Rick shook his head, his frustration bubbling over again. Why does everyone keep saying that? If you know something, why don't you just spit it out? The older man hesitated, glancing at the door to the restricted area as if weighing his next words carefully. "You think this is about some guy disrespecting you," he said finally. "But what's happening here is bigger than you, bigger than any of us." Rick opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the door to the restricted area swung open again. This time, it wasn't the quiet man or the suits. It was the nurse from earlier, her face pale and her movements hurried. She barely glanced at Rick and the others, instead rushing to the receptionist. "It's happening," she said in a hushed but urgent tone. The receptionist's face tightened, and she nodded. Understood. She reached for the phone and started making calls, her voice calm but brisk. Rick frowned, stepping closer. "What's happening?" The nurse turned to him, her expression a mix of irritation and concern. "You need to leave. Now." "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what's going on." Rick shot back, his frustration peaking. The older man sighed heavily, his grip tightening on his cane. "Kid, you don't want to be here when this goes down. Trust me." Before Rick could respond, the quiet man emerged from the restricted area. His calm demeanor was unchanged, but there was an urgency in his movements now, a purpose that couldn't be ignored. He walked straight past Rick without a glance, heading toward the exit. "Hey," Rick called after him, but the man didn't stop. Rick's instincts took over, and he followed, his group trailing reluctantly behind him. The quiet man stepped outside into the parking lot, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. Rick caught up to him, grabbing his shoulder. "You're not going anywhere until you tell me what's going on." The quiet man turned slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just studied Rick with a look that felt uncomfortably like pity. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said finally. Rick squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "Not until I get some answers." The quiet man sighed, his gaze shifting to the parking lot around them. "All right," he said. "You want answers? Here's one for you. This isn't about you. It never was." Rick frowned, confusion flashing across his face. "Then what is it about?" Before the quiet man could respond, the sound of tires screeching filled the air. A black SUV tore into the parking lot, its tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and the doors flew open. Rick and his group froze as more men in suits stepped out, their movements sharp and precise. They fanned out quickly, their attention focused solely on the quiet man. One of them, clearly in charge, spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder. "We have him. Moving to secure." The quiet man didn't flinch, his expression as calm as ever. He turned back to Rick, his voice low and measured. "This is your last chance to walk away. Take it." But Rick couldn't move. He was frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The lead suit approached the quiet man, holding up what looked like a badge. "Reynolds, you know the drill. Let's make this easy." Rick blinked, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Asterisk Reynolds, asterisk, the name the nurse had said earlier. This man wasn't just some random patient. He was someone important, someone dangerous. Before anyone could react, the quiet man, Reynolds, moved. His hand shot out, grabbing the lead suit's wrist and twisting it sharply. The man dropped the badge with a grunt of pain, and chaos erupted. The other suits moved in, but Reynolds was faster. He ducked and dodged, his movements fluid and precise, taking down one man after another with an efficiency that left Rick and his group speechless. Rick watched, his heart pounding, as Reynolds disarmed the last man and turned back to the group. "Like I said," he said calmly, "you don't want to be here." He dropped the weapon he'd taken, his movements deliberate, and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as sirens wailed in the distance. Rick stood there, stunned and speechless, as the aftermath unfolded around him. He didn't know who Reynolds really was or what had just happened. But one thing was clear. He had been way out of his league from the start. As the sirens grew louder, Rick turned to his group, his voice hoarse. "Let's get out of here." For once, no one argued. They climbed onto their bikes and roared away, leaving the chaos behind. But the questions and unease lingered long after they were gone. The roar of the bikes faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum of the late afternoon. Rick and his crew didn't stop until they were miles away from the hospital, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. They pulled off the highway into an empty parking lot, the silence between them louder than the engines had been. Rick sat on his bike, staring at the ground, his thoughts spinning. No one spoke at first. The tension from the encounter, the sheer confusion of it all, hung heavily in the air. It was Dale who finally broke the silence, his voice shaky. "What the hell just happened back there?" he asked, looking at Rick. Rick didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we were way out of our depth." Dale laughed nervously, shaking his head. "You think?" "That guy, Reynolds or whoever he is, he took out all those suits like it was nothing. And those weren't just security guards, man. They were something else." Rick glanced at the others, their faces reflecting his own unease. "Yeah," he said quietly. "And he kept telling us to walk away. We should have listened." Dale nodded, his usual bravado completely gone. "Do you think he's some kind of agent or something? Like government?" Rick shrugged. "Could be. Or maybe he's running from them. Either way, it's not our problem anymore." He paused, the weight of his words settling on him. "We're lucky we got out of there in one piece." The group fell silent again, each of them processing the day in their own way. For Rick, it was a humbling moment. He had always prided himself on being fearless, on never backing down from a challenge. But today had been a stark reminder that some battles weren't his to fight. "I guess we've got a story to tell," Dale said after a while, trying to lighten the mood. But no one laughed. Rick shook his head. No, we keep this to ourselves. He looked at the group, his tone serious. Whatever was going on back there, it's not for us to share. We don't know the whole story, and honestly, I don't want to. The others nodded, their agreement unspoken but clear. They had stepped into something they didn't understand, and now all they wanted was to leave it behind. As they started their bikes and headed back toward the highway, Rick couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. Reynolds, the men in suits, the way the nurse had looked so panicked. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. But maybe he didn't need to. Maybe it was enough to know that he had been given a chance to walk away, and he had taken it. Back at the hospital, the aftermath was already being cleaned up. The suits who had been taken down were being tended to by medical staff, their injuries minimal, but their pride clearly wounded. The lead suit, now nursing a sprained wrist, spoke into a secure phone line, his voice clipped. Reynolds got away. He's as good as he ever was. We'll track him again, but it'll take time. The nurse from earlier watched from the corner, her expression unreadable. She glanced at the receptionist, who was calmly deleting footage from the hallway cameras, as instructed. Whatever had happened here today, it wasn't meant to leave the hospital walls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rick and his crew pulled into their usual hangout spot, a dusty diner on the edge of town. They sat at their usual booth, the familiar setting providing a small sense of comfort after the day's chaos. Dale leaned back in his seat, sipping his coffee. So what now? Rick stared out the window, the orange glow of the setting sun reflecting in his eyes. Now, he said after a long pause, we move on. Let this be a lesson. Dale smirked. A lesson in what? Not sticking our noses where they don't belong. Rick smiled faintly, the first real smile since they'd left the hospital. Something like that. The group laughed softly, the tension finally beginning to ease. They didn't have all the answers, and maybe they never would. But for now, they were safe. That was enough. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Rick couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of curiosity about Reynolds. Who was he, really? What had he been running from, or toward? But those questions would remain unanswered, and Rick was starting to be okay with that. The bikers stayed at the diner until the stars filled the night sky, their laughter and camaraderie slowly returning. When they finally hit the road again, the events of the day felt a little more distant, like a strange dream they'd all shared. And somewhere far away, Reynolds disappeared into the night, his movements deliberate and silent. For him, the day's events were just another chapter in a much larger story, one the bikers would never know. As Rick rode under the starlit sky, the cool wind on his face, he realized that sometimes the smartest thing you could do was walk away. Some battles weren't worth fighting, and some mysteries were better left unsolved. He felt a strange sense of peace in that realization, a calm he hadn't expected. It wasn't the ending Rick had imagined, but it was the one he needed. And as the highway stretched out before him, he felt the weight of the day finally lift, leaving only the hum of the engine and the open road ahead.